Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Are there any questions before we start? Anyone has any questions? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
For homework 4, did you say that you would move the date a couple more days later, or am I wrong?
Yeah, I did, and I guess I did make that announcement. Did you check the announcements?
You say it's November 12th.
November 12th, correct.
Yeah, but on the homework assignment on your titanium, it say we are late.
No, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that, because I've already extended it to November 12th.
Okay.
Yeah, and I sent you a note. Did you get that note?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, just go with that note that I sent you, that the homework will be due on November 12th. Now, don't worry about what titanium says. If it says you're late, that's okay. Don't worry about that, because it's due November 12th.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Hey, Professor, I have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking on the class report to see what's going on over there, but I couldn't know what is required exactly.
Okay.
So when is it due and what should I do there?
Yeah, the class report, all what it wants is you write a one-page summary of what you learned in this class. What is the thing that caught your attention, or that you learned, or that you were able to use for any future narratives that you may have regarding international economics? That's all I need, in your own words, in one page. And you need to submit that by the end of the semester.
Right,
That's
that's
all.
great.
Mm-hmm. Is that clear? Does that make it clear to you?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. So that's basically what the class report is. All what I need from you is a one-page summary of everything that you have learned in this class, or what your expectations were in taking this class, were your expectations met or not? Were you able to gain any knowledge from taking this class or not? So that's basically what I want from you. Okay, today what we want to do is we want to start a new chapter, which is obviously chapter 10, the balance of payments. And now the balance of payments, of course, is extremely important, as you will see. And just pay a little bit of attention here, because I will probably be answering all of the questions in the homework. I will not tell you that this is the answer, or the answer is not going to be direct, but you'll be able to deduce from what I would say here and how I will say it, that you'll be able to answer all the questions in your homework. Anyway, so basically, really, what this chapter is about, it's simply, well, what I'm trying to do here is simply, we will try to examine the monetary aspects of international trade. Now, remember what we have done so far when we looked at international trade. We dealt with trade models that helped us understand if it makes sense for countries to trade with one another. Will countries gain from trade? who will win and who will lose from trade. We talked about the pattern of trade. How is the pattern of trade determined? We talked about how do we determine competitive advantage? Well, we talked about how restricting trade by imposing tariffs would lead to economic inefficiency, would lead to a reduction in consumer surplus. So, all of that we dealt with. And this really has to do with the dynamics and structure of international trade. So we dealt with that. Hopefully by now we have a good idea of all the issues pertaining to international trade. Now, and that was, by the way, all micro perspective of international trade. Today, we want to take a macro, not micro, but macro perspective of international trade. We want to basically see how international trade becomes an important element in the income and production of a country. In other words, we try to look at the links between international trade and economic production or aggregate production or aggregate income. So in fact, we're going to be looking at a macro perspective of trade. To do that, we need the help of balance of payments, because without the balance of payments, we will not be able to determine what kind of links exist between international trade and the aggregate economy or aggregate production. So we will be forced to bring in the balance of payments. Hopefully, we will use that as a tool to help us understand the broader ramifications of trade on the economy. And also, what we want to do is we really want to look at international trade by simply considering the nature and significance of a nation's balance of payment. Okay, so then let's start with the balance of payment, and let's see what is meant by the balance of payments. The balance of payments obviously is a summary of all the financial transactions that take place between one country and the rest of the world. That's what a balance of payment is. It records all types of economic and financial transactions between one country and the rest of the world. So we're going to record everything that we do for the whole year under the balance of payments. And when we talk about international transactions here, as the author points out, what it means is simply it's an exchange of goods, services, assets, whether these assets are financial or physical, between residents of one country and those of another. Now, let's see here what is meant by residents when we talk about residents of one country. The residents would include business, individuals, government agencies that make the country their legal domicile. In other words, you happen to live in that country, you are a citizen of that country. Then you are a resident. Then you are considered to be a resident. If you happen to live in that country, or if you are a national of that country. Basically, you don't have to be a national, but if you happen to live there and work there, and obviously, though your whole family is there with you, then obviously, you're simply a resident of that country, a legal resident, basically. That's what we mean. So that's what a balance of payment will record. It will record all the economic and financial transaction that will take place between the residents of one country and the rest of the world. Okay, now, another thing that we have to know about the balance of payment, so hopefully now we know what the balance of payment is. The other thing that we need to know is how do we enter these economic and financial activities that take place between one country and the rest of the world? How do we record it? How do we enter it into the balance of payment? Where do we put it? Now, one thing that we have to know here before we start is that the balance of payment utilizes a double entry booking system. A double entry booking system, or it is based on what we call double entry accounting. I'm sure most of you who have taken accounting would know, but it's a very simple concept. What double entry means is that whenever you enter an item as a credit, you also have to enter that same item as a debit somewhere else. So when you do that, the balance of payment will always balance. When you're using a double entry accounting, the balance of payment will always balance, because I may be entering a certain item as a credit in my current account, and I may be entering as a debit in my financial account. Now, a credit transaction results in a receipt of a payment from foreigners. And by convention, a credit will always have a plus sign attached to it. So that's a credit transaction. So a credit transaction basically deals with all financial inflows. So any financial inflow that comes into a country will be recorded as a credit transaction and will always have a plus sign. A debit transaction is one that leads to a payment to foreigners and will be recorded with a minus sign. So a debit transaction represents financial outflows. So a credit transaction represents financial inflows. A debit transaction represents a financial outflow. So this is basically how we will enter different transactions in the balance of payments, based on whether they are credit transactions or debit transaction. If it is a credit transaction, I'm going to put a plus sign to it. If it's a debit transaction, I'm going to attach a minus sign to it. And again, the best way to remember whether a transaction is a credit or debit is simply to think in terms of cash outflows or financial outflows versus cash or financial inflows. So an inflow is a credit, an outflow is a debit. Very simple. Doesn't really require that much explanation. Straightforward. Now, what are the examples of credits? again, what do you think exports would be? Will exports be a credit or a debit? How will I enter the exports of goods and services in the balance of payments?
Credits?
Credit? Anyone else? Everyone agrees? Okay, why do you say credit?
No, I'll tell you the truth. I think it's debit. Credit
No,
is
you're right. You're right. You're right.
Oh, okay, cool. Then,
You're
all
right.
right, I'm good then. I'll
Yeah,
stick with
you're right.
credits. Because you're gonna get a fluctuation of money, and I
Very
think
good.
that's
Exactly. Because money is coming in, right? When you export goods and services, what are you going to get in return? Going to get in return payments from foreign residents. Money coming in. Cash inflow. That's a credit. Okay. How about if I invest in a Japanese bond? What will that be?
This is an outflow.
Which is a
debit.
Debit.
debit. Very good. It's a debit. Okay. Now, how about if I have invested, let's say, $1 million in, I don't know, a French stock, and I was able to earn, let's say, $100,000. What would that transaction be?
It will be
Credit.
credit.
Credit, very good. Credit, because simply I'm going to bring that money back and deposit it in my bank account. This is what I made on my foreign investment. I made $100,000. So that's going to come back to me. So that will be cash inflow. So that would be a credit. Okay? So I guess you pretty much get the whole idea here. Okay. So now we know how we're going to be entering these items in my balance of payments. Do I enter them as a credit or as a debit? And then once I decide if they're credit, I'm going to put a plus sign. And if they are debit, I'm going to put a minus sign next to it. So hopefully everyone understands that. Now let's go next to the balance, the structure of the balance of payments. Very, very important. How is the balance of payments structured? Now, we're going to make it as simple as possible, even though the balance of payments can be rather complicated, because if I really want to use everything that we see in the balance of payments, oh boy, probably there's going to be so many accounts and sub-accounts, so many categories that will make your head spin. So here we're going to make it very, very easy and simple. Why? Because really we are not interested in the inner structure of the balance of payments. In other words, we're not interested in the details. We are rather interested in one thing, how the balance of payments is structured, but we're not interested in the details, and how the balance of payment will help me show the links between trade, international trade, and aggregate production or aggregate income. That's all. That's all I'm interested in the balance of payments for. I'm really not interested in all the minute details and all the different and specific categories that are included in the balance of payments. So what am I going to do here? I'm going to divide the balance of payments into two accounts. One account is known as the current account, and the other account is known as the financial account. That's it. I don't want to know anything about any other accounts. All what I need, current account, financial account. Okay, what am I going to include in the current account? The current account will have 3 items included. And I have written them right here as notes, I guess. Can everyone see the notes here that I put?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, current account is simply equal to net exports
I
plus,
cannot see it, Professor.
yeah,
I cannot see it.
you cannot see it?
Mm-mm.
Why is that?
It's really small in the bottom left corner outside of the slide.
Oh boy, I don't know how to enlarge that.
No, she could. I think she used to just maximize her screen, but I think
Oh.
you just gotta tell her it's the equation.
Yeah, well, anyway, let me just read it for you out, for those of you who um, can't see it. Net current account CA, that's CA. I wish we could write it here. Oh, that's better. Current account is equal to net exports plus, now I hope you can see this, right?
Yes.
Okay, plus net investment income. This is the current account. Now forget about this here. This is not a minus, by the way. So the current account is equal to net exports plus net unilateral transfers plus net investment income. So you may want to write those down just in case you forget them later on. Again.
Can you say that NUT again, please?
Yeah. Net unilateral transfers. You want me to write it down for you?
NX is next income?
Net exports. NX is net exports.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So net exports plus net unilateral transfers plus net investment income. Everyone got that, or you want me to go over it one more time?
Got it.
Okay.
And NIY is net investment income?
Correct. Now, sometimes we also tend to refer to net exports as the balance of trade or trade balance, which is equal to exports minus imports. That's what your net exports is your trade balance. Exports minus imports. And sometimes really, when we talk about the current account, all that we have in mind is the trade balance. In other words, the first item. We pretty much ignore these 2 items. Not that they are not important, but we simply ignore them for the simple reason because we're pretty much interested in the trade balance. Exports minus imports. Exports of goods and services minus the imports of goods and services. That's what we base all of international trade on. Now, remember what I said before. I said that we want to look at the linkage between international trade and aggregate production. So this really represents the major part of international trade. That's why we happen to emphasize the trade balance in the current account. Now remember, when we talk about aggregate production or aggregate income, what do we represent aggregate production or aggregate income by? Anyone? GDP, correct?
Yes.
GDP, that's your aggregate income, or that's your aggregate production. Now, what is GDP? What is GDP equal to? C, consumption, plus I, investment, plus G, government purchases, plus what?
X minus M.
Exactly, net exports. And then what did we say net exports is? Trade balance. And what did we say current account is? A big chunk of the current account is net exports. Okay? A big chunk of that current account is represented by net exports. So now do you see the link between aggregate production and international trade? Does everyone, are you beginning to see the link or not yet?
Kind of.
Yes.
Okay, very good. That's what I want to get to. I want at least to make you aware of the link between international trade and aggregate income. International trade is represented by NX, net exports. Aggregate income or aggregate production is represented by GDP. So you can see that there is a link between international trade and aggregate production. So if this increases, what happens to GDP? Come on, it's easy. If NX increases, what happens to GDP?
Increases.
Increases. So when international trade is vibrant, when international trade is promoted, when international trade increases, what do we hope to see will happen to our aggregate income or aggregate production?
Hope it will increase.
It will increase, exactly. So, I mean, when we talk about international trade and aggregate production, we're not talking in a vacuum here. We know exactly what we're talking about. Okay, so let's leave that alone. We will come back to it later on, of course. But I just thought that it's important that you see right there in front of your eyes, in that mathematical equation, simple equation, the links between international trade and aggregate production. And I'm sure, by the way, a lot of students who took this course or went through this course in international economics, if you ask them, okay, how do you link international trade to aggregate production? They will probably not be able to answer it. But now I know all of you are able to answer this question. And I know you're going to remember this for a long time. Okay. Now let's go back to the current account. So we said the current account has three items: net exports, net unilateral transfers, net investment income. Net exports, I don't think I need to basically explain it any further. I'm sorry, I guess we were. Everyone knows what net exports is, correct? So I don't need to explain that anymore. And when we're talking about net exports here, we're simply talking about the exports of goods and services minus the imports of goods and services. We know exactly how to enter the value of exports in our current account balance as a credit. And we know exactly how to enter imports into our current account balance. And we're going to enter it as a debit. So that takes care of net exports. Now, the second thing that we need to talk about is, okay, let me just go all the way down because I think this would help you a little bit. Yeah, to the balance of payment here, since we're talking about the structure of the balance of payment. Okay. All right, now. You can see from there that this is the balance of payments for the US for 2014, and everything is measured in billions of dollars. So the first item that you see right there, it's simply exports, which is 1.6 trillion. And you can see that there is a plus sign attached to it, simply because it is a credit. And then imports, which is 2.4 trillion. And you see a minus sign attached to it, simply because imports are a debit. Also, you see on the top, there is a merchandise trade balance. And the merchandise trade balance is simply the 2.4 trillion minus the 1.6 trillion. That will give you a negative 735. So if you take your exports, 1.6 minus the 2.4 trillion, that will give you a negative 735. And that would be the merchandise trade balance. It's exports minus imports. Now, the service balance for the US is positive, which simply means that we are exporting more services than we are importing, to the tune of $231 billion. So we're doing very well on the service sector, but we are not doing so well on the merchandise sector. Okay, now when you take both the merchandise and the service and put them together, we get a balance of a negative 504. So that would be the balance on the goods and services in the current account, 504. Now we look at income receipts and payments balance. The income receipts and payment balance is what we call the investment income that we talked about earlier on. Here, of course, that number refers to the net investment income, which means that we will be investing money abroad and we will be getting a return on that money. That return is our investment income. This is the income that we get from investing. Let's say, for example, if I purchase a $1 million bond in Japan, let's say, and that will pay me $100,000 at the end of the year. This is my investment income. And I will bring that $100,000 back here. The same thing, a Japanese may invest $1 million in a US Treasury. And that Japanese investor at the end of the year might get $80,000 interest on that treasury. So now for me to get net investment income, all what I need to do is take credit minus debit. That's how you calculate the net. You always take credit minus debit, just like we did here. We took exports minus imports, and we came up with net exports, which is a negative 735. This is my net exports. I'm sorry, it's this one right here, because we want to both goods and services together. So we don't want to look at only goods or services, we want to look at both. In other words, net exports of goods and services. And that would be a negative 504. How did we do that? We simply took exports minus imports, credits minus debits. The same thing here. When I want to determine what the net investment income is, I have to take credits minus debits. So the credit is simply what US investors get from their investment, the income that they get from their investment, minus what foreigners get from their investment here in the US. Because the income that foreigners get from their investment in the US is a debit for the US. And the investment income that US residents get from their foreign investment is a credit. So I have to take credit minus debit to come up with net investment. Is this clear? Anyone needs any clarification on this? How do we compute the nets? Again, always credit minus debit. Now, sometimes what you get in investment income added besides the income that you get on your investment, what is added to this item is sometimes what US, in other words, you may have US citizens employed overseas, and you may have foreign citizens employed in the US. Now, US citizens employed overseas, they may get a certain salary. They will probably spend part of that salary, and the rest, they will probably send it home and put it in their bank account. So whatever they send back home that goes into their bank accounts will be what? A credit or a debit?
Credit.
What's that?
Credit.
Credit, very good. It will be a credit. Why? Because it's cash inflow. Same thing with foreign workers. They will get paid a certain amount here in the US. They will spend part of that here in the US, and the rest, they will send it home and put it in their bank accounts, hopefully to accumulate enough so as to be able to buy a house or, you know, real estate or whatever they want in their home country, basically. So what will that be?
Debit.
Debit. Very good. So all of that will be included in the net investment income. In other words, employees may not spend all of their income, They may spend some, but the rest, they will ship it back home. And that will be part of net investment income. So the net investment income will include all types of payments and receipts relegated to income. And then we come to unilateral transfer balance, or NUT, N-U-T, net unilateral transfers. What does this mean? Unilateral transactions are defined as those transactions that a resident will make. Now again, remember what a resident is. Anyone, what is a resident? How did we define a resident?
Businesses, individuals, government agencies that make the country their legal domicile.
Very good, excellent. That's what a resident is. So any transaction made by a resident that he or she does not expect anything in return is known as a unilateral transfer. For example, suppose I, as an individual, happen to contribute, let's say, $300 to a fund that helps the poor overseas. That's a unilateral transfer. Why? Because I'm not expecting anything in return. So any transaction or any transfer that you make and you expect nothing in return, it's known as unilateral. That's why we call it unilateral. That's what unilateral means. It's a one-way street, basically. You're not expecting anything in return. With one exception, maybe, you know, when you buy a friend of yours who happens to live in Europe a birthday present, you probably in the back of your mind expect that, you know, you're going to get that back on your birthday, right? So probably we should not put that under unilateral transfer, but usually, you know, it is included as a unilateral transfer because, hey, when you buy that birthday present, you are obviously, you know, I mean, you can receive another present for your birthday, or you may not. So, you know, there's nothing guaranteed there. So in other words, that's the reason why it's known as a unilateral transfer. Or, for example, the government in the US happens to send some relief to a country that is facing a natural disaster. That is also a unilateral transfer. Or, for example, a church here in the US happens to send, I don't know, $100,000 worth of rice or wheat or whatever it is to some poverty-stricken country. That's also a unilateral transfer. So does everyone know what a unilateral transfer is?
I have a question.
Yes.
Is unilateral transfer, is that always going to be a negative balance? Or could it be like if we were in trouble, like some nation would like send us money, so it'd be positive?
Yeah, exactly. It will be positive if we're receiving, and it will be negative if we're sending. And the net can be positive, negative, or zero. It all depends how much we're receiving versus how much we're paying out. Does this make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So you see, for the US, it will always turn out to be negative. Why? Because the US happens to be sending more or transferring more financial resources overseas than they actually receive. And for that reason, the net unilateral transfer for the US is always negative. And from 2014, you can see that unilateral transfer balance for the US is a negative $123.8 billion. Now, if you add all those three items together, net exports plus net unilateral transfers plus net investment income, you will get what your current account balance is. So in this case, the current account balance is a negative 410. So you can see, even though the two other items, income receipts and payment balance of 217, unilateral transfer balance of a negative 123, if you add those two together, you will end up with a positive number, right? In other words, the income receipts more than compensates for the unilateral transfer balance, but still you will end up with a negative current account balance. So from here, what do we identify or recognize as the most important item in the current account balance? Anyone?
What's the question again?
What's that?
What's the question again?
What do you think the most important item is in the current account balance?
Merchandise trade balance.
Yeah, which is what?
The net
Export.
exports. Yeah.
Good. Net exports. So now, when you see us talk about the current account in terms of net exports, is that legitimate or not? Does that make sense or not?
What was it one more time?
When we talk about the current account balance as being mainly net exports, and we happen to ignore the other two items, can we do that?
I mean, no. I mean, like, the trade balance is important, but there's other items on the list.
Yeah, but those two on the list, do they really make any difference here in as far as the current account balance is?
Not really.
Not really. It's still negative. It really doesn't turn it into positive territory. And the reason, again, is simply because these two values are so small, relative. I mean, you're talking about 123 billion, 217 billion versus 2 trillion and 1.6 trillion. I mean, you know, it's a huge difference, I guess. But anyway, you know, this is just to give you an idea of what's going on here. So we get a current account balance. Now, the other account in the balance of payments is the financial account. Now remember, your author calls it capital and financial account. In other words, your author does really not make any distinction between the capital and financial. They're simply one. And this is really what I'm going to do here. I'm simply going to look at financial account only. I'm really not interested in all the other accounts. In fact, here I have written down here as a note that there is also another account on the balance of payments, which we usually refer to as the official settlement account, which includes only the transactions that are placed by official monetary authorities, such as the Fed and the Treasury. In other words, all the financial transactions that take place between the Fed and the Treasury here in the US and the central banks and the Ministry of Finance in foreign countries. Those transactions belong to the official settlement account. And we can have all other accounts, by the way, in the financial account. That's why at the beginning, if you remember, I said we really can make it complicated if we want. We can branch all these transactions into several branches, and we could fill this page with different transactions in the financial account. So all what that would mean is that you have to memorize more accounts, more items, more transactions, and it becomes really very, very complicated to follow. But to make things simple, we said that we're going to include everything under one item basically, and that is US net borrowing measured by capital financial account transactions. And that will be $141.6 billion. This is how much we are borrowing from the outside world. And this would include government agencies, businesses, banks, individuals, you name it. All of us are responsible for borrowing $141.6 billion, more than we are lending to foreign residents. So that's why that number is positive right here. It's a credit. This is the money coming into the US. This is how much we have borrowed in 2014. Now, according to what we said before, the balance of payments should always balance. Why? Because it is based on double entry bookkeeping. However, on the one hand, I have my current account balance is a negative 410, and my financial account is a positive 141. So these two obviously do not add up to zero. They have to. So what do I need to do to make that happen? I need to add what we call a statistical discrepancy. And that statistical discrepancy would be equal to 269. So if you add 141.6 to 269, you will get a total balance on the financial account that will be exactly equal to 410.6 billion. And this will make the balance of payment balance out, meaning it will sum to zero. Current account plus financial account will be equal to zero. And this is what the balance of payment ought to be. However, in reality, this is not the case. In reality, we can hardly, or it's impossible, to get the balance of payment balance to zero. The reason, of course, it all rests on what we enter into the financial account, because this is the most complicated account. This account is very simple, easy, straightforward, easy to get the numbers, easy to compute them, easy to come up with this number right here. However, when it comes to the financial account, extremely difficult, very complex. So all those who are involved in putting together the balance of payments, in other words, employees in the BEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, those are the ones who actually compute and figure out and estimate all the numbers that go into the financial account. Those employees happen to face a lot of problems when it comes to coming up with the right data to enter it. So there is a lot of statistical errors, omissions, measurement errors, and sometimes they really end up really extrapolating some of that data because they don't have it. So they have to extrapolate it based on what occurred 3, 4, 5 years ago. They have to fill in the blanks. In other words, they can just leave it blank. So they end up extrapolating. Because of that, it's impossible to get the financial account to be exactly equal to the current account balance. So in theory, this is what we expect to have. But in practice, in reality, we really have to add a statistical discrepancy. We have no choice. We got to add a statistical discrepancy. Now, sometimes with a statistical discrepancy, this may raise the red flag. Like in this case, in 2014. I mean, if I was an auditor, the first thing I would say, hey, this statistical discrepancy is simply too high. 269, that's over 50% of the total. So I'm going to put 50% as a statistical discrepancy? No, I'm not going to do that. So really, if I were the one who was actually compiling and putting all these together, I have to go back to the drawing boards and find exactly what went wrong. But for some reason, this basically slipped through, and this is what we have. This is what we have, a statistical discrepancy, 269. So, I mean, this just shows you the difficulties involved in coming up with these numbers. It's not as easy as all of us may think it is. In other words, I really feel sorry for those people who have to come up with these numbers and enter this data. It's such a boring job. It's such an excruciating job. And I don't know, I don't think I really have the patience to sit down and go through, the different numbers and compute and crank, extrapolate, find samples. It's just too excruciating. And for me, probably, I will not be very good at doing this type of job. I mean, it is what it is. So I just want you to know that it's extremely difficult to obviously determine the balance of payments, to calculate the balance of payments, for the simple reason because it involves so many things, so many transactions, so many accounts, and at times it gets so complicated. Okay, now, having said that, now let's go back to I don't know if this is what we want to do or not. Yeah, let's look at this table here very quickly. And this looks at the balance of payments for the US from 1980 to 2014. You can see that the US had a surplus on its current account balance in 1980, very, very small surplus, 2.4 billion. But from then on, the US economy has been plagued by this huge current account deficits. And at times, by the way, I don't know, it's probably somewhere, I guess, around 2006, I believe. Yeah, I think it's about 2006 that the current account deficit reached about $740 billion. That's huge. Now you're talking very close to $1 trillion. That's unacceptable. And I don't know why that really nothing has been done, or at least, something has been done basically, because you can see that the current account deficit has been falling. In 2014, it went down to 410, but 2015, 2016, 2017, it went up again to about 525. But, it is what it is again. And we will explain the reason why the US economy has been experiencing trade deficits for such a long time. And we will also talk about whether it's a good thing to have trade deficit or a bad thing. So we will look at the cost and the benefit of trade deficits or current account deficits. And we will also look at the cause of the current account deficit. So all of these things, hopefully, we will shed some light on. But the other thing that really we want to look at is, let's see here. No, we will want to leave this till later on. Let's see what else is there that we want to. Yeah, the other thing that I really want to talk about probably would be the official reserve assets. What are the official reserve assets? There are 4 official reserve assets: gold, SDRs, convertible currencies, and reserve position with the IMF. These are the 4 official reserve assets.
Wait, I'm sorry, did you say SDR?
Yes, SDR, special drawing rights. Now, special drawing rights is a currency that is printed by the IMF. It's like the US dollars. It's a US currency printed by the Federal Reserve Bank. The euro, it's a currency printed by the ECB, the Central Bank of Europe. So SDR is simply a currency that is printed by the IMF, and the IMF is a global financial institution that's extremely important for facilitating trade and financial stability, global financial stability. That's the function of the IMF. It's to make sure that countries are able to trade with one another under agreeable circumstances and environment, very stable financial environment. And the IMF will do everything in its power to facilitate this. So the IMF happens to give out loans to those countries that need them in order to be able to address their current account deficits. And they will also give loans for countries that will try to stabilize their currencies. So the IMF plays an important role in making sure that there is global financial stability. And the IMF, of course, has about 185 member countries. Each country happens to pay a membership fee, which is called a quota. And that membership fee depends on the economic strength of that country in terms of its GDP, and also depends on how much trade that country does with the rest of the world. Now, the SDR, the special drawing right, gets its value. In other words, how do we know the value of one SDR? How much is it equivalent in terms of the dollar or whatever? In other words, where does it get its value? Well, its value is determined based on a basket of currencies: the US dollar, the euro, the Japanese yen, and the British pound. The US dollar weighs about 40% of the basket. Or 42 or 43, somewhere around there. I really don't remember the weights right now, but I guess, it's around that. And then the rest, which is about 60 or maybe 57%, is determined by the other three currencies: the euro, the Japanese yen, and the British pound. As we will see later on when we talk about exchange rates, we find that most small countries happen to fix their currency to the SDR, to the value of the SDR. So instead of fixing it to the US dollar, they try to fix it to the SDR, which is very smart. Why? Simply because the SDR has the dollar, the yen, the euro, and the British pound. So in fact, all what you're doing when you are fixing it to the SDR, you're pretty much fixing it to the four major currencies. So you're spreading the risk, basically. That's why I said it's a smart idea to fix your currency to the SDR rather than to the dollar. And most small countries do that. Those that happen to fix their currencies, have a fixed exchange rate, they try to fix their currencies to the SDR rather than to the dollar. Okay, well, we'll talk about this when we talk about exchange rates. So those are the four official reserve assets: gold, convertible currencies, SDRs, and reserve position at the IMF. Each country has a reserve position at the IMF. Like, for example, if you look at the banks in the US, each bank has a reserve account with the Fed. The same thing with the IMF. All member countries happen to have a reserve account with the IMF. Some countries' reserve may be low, other countries' reserve may be high, other countries' reserve may be just right. Now, why would countries want to keep reserves with the IMF? Well, the reason why they want to do that is because the higher the reserve you have, the higher the amount of money you can borrow or loans that you can get from the IMF with no fees attached. So you can see how much you will be saving in terms of fees if you have a high reserve position with the IMF. Now, you don't have to hold a reserve position with the IMF, by the way. But countries do that for the simple reason because, hey, they want to make sure that... now, I don't know if... I really didn't go deep into this, and I don't know if they're getting an interest on that, a rate of return. I'm pretty much sure that the IMF does pay a return on the, like, for example, now banks nowadays in the US, they do get some sort of return on their reserves with the Fed. Before they didn't, but the law has changed, and now they can actually get a rate of return on whatever reserves they hold with the Fed. Same thing with the IMF. So those are the four things that determine the official reserve assets of any country. Are there any questions before we close?
Yeah, I have one. I was AFK for like a split second. What does IMF stand for?
Yeah, International Monetary Fund. Any other questions? I'm sure some of you must have some questions. Any questions? No? Okay, then, if no questions, I guess I need to close the session. And I guess I will see you on Thursday. And again, for those of you who came in late, the homework 4 has been postponed, and it's due on November 12th.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you,
All
Professor.
right. Thank you very much. I will see you all next time. Take care.